In the heart of Los Angeles, where protests echo through the crowded streets and voices clash over questions of justice, an old veteran named James Walker sits in silence on a weathered park bench. He's a man who's seen too much and asked for nothing. His quiet presence a gentle defiance in a world that never seems to notice. When ICE agents arrive, demanding answers he's already given 100 times before, the air grows thick with tension. Suddenly, a K9 dog breaks loose, charging at James, and what happens next leaves everyone who was there speechless. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The late afternoon sun painted Grant Park in soft golden light, catching in the tops of the swaying palms and the worn edges of the old benches. The city of Los Angeles buzzed beyond the park gates, restless and uneasy. That day, the air was heavy with the echoes of chants and the crackle of protest signs held high. I watched it all from a small distance, seated under the shade of an oak tree whose limbs had weathered decades of seasons. My job as a community volunteer had always felt quiet, almost invisible. I was there to make sure everyone was safe, to offer water and first aid if needed, but mostly I watched. That's when I noticed him, an older man sitting alone on one of the benches that faced the fountain, his head bowed in quiet thought. His name was James Walker. He had the look of someone who'd seen the world through different eyes, deep lines carved into his pale face, the kind that only come from years of living and carrying the weight of memories. His hands rested on his knees, fingers curled lightly as if holding something that only he could see. He wore an old military field jacket, the color faded to a dusty green, with patches at the elbows where the fabric had worn thin. His shoulders slumped, but there was still a quiet dignity in the way he sat. He didn't fidget. He didn't shift. He was as much a part of that park bench as the wood itself. I watched him because, in a city that moved too fast to notice, he made me pause. He didn't seem to mind the noise around him, or the swirl of life that pressed in from every side. The protests had drawn thousands that day, spilling from the streets into the park, voices raised in anger and in fear, banners and flags waved overhead, the wind snapping them like sails caught in a storm. The noise didn't touch James. His eyes, a pale blue that caught the last of the sun, were turned inward. There was a stillness to him, like he'd spent so long carrying the weight of the world that he'd learned how to make his own kind of peace. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, louder than the chants echoing off the marble statues nearby. I wondered what brought him here, to this park on this day. Maybe it was the same thing that brought the rest of us. Maybe he was searching for something, or maybe he was just tired of searching altogether. The lines in his face told stories I could only guess at, but he didn't seem like the kind of man to offer them freely. As the protest moved closer, the chants rose and fell like waves. No more raids, they called out, voices fierce and trembling. Families belong together. The words carried across the lawn, rippling through the crowd. But James didn't flinch. He kept his gaze steady, his back straight, his breath slow and measured. I could see the ICE officers moving through the crowd, their dark jackets marked with white letters. They moved with practiced purpose, their eyes scanning faces, their hands resting on belts heavy with gear. They weren't like the city police, who stood near the barricades, watching but mostly staying back. No, these officers were here for a reason, to question, to check, to make sure everyone belonged. When they reached the edge of the park, I saw one of them pause. He pointed, a small motion that cut through the afternoon calm. His partner nodded, and they began to walk toward the man on the bench, toward James. I felt my breath catch. He looked so small then, hunched in his old field jacket, a solitary figure among the restless waves of the city. But he didn't move. His hands stayed folded on his lap, and he lifted his chin just enough to meet their eyes as they approached. "Good afternoon, sir," one of them said, his voice flat and official. "May we see some identification?" James didn't answer right away. He blinked once, and then reached slowly into his jacket pocket. His movements were deliberate, as if even this simple action took more effort than he had to spare. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "I'm just resting," he said. "That's all." The ICE agent shifted his weight. "We're conducting a routine check. Sir, can you show us some ID proof of citizenship?" I could see the way James's fingers trembled as he pulled out an old wallet, the leather cracked and soft with age. He held it out without a word, his eyes steady, refusing to drop. There was no anger there, no fear, just a tired kind of patience, the kind that comes when you've learned how to live with the questions that never seem to stop. The agent flipped through the worn plastic sleeves, frowning as he looked at a faded veteran's ID. For a moment, he hesitated, but then his partner leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't enough," he said, his tone sharper. "We need something current, something official." James took the wallet back, sliding it carefully into his pocket. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He only looked at them with that same calm gaze, as if he'd been through this before, as if he understood that sometimes silence was the only armor a man had left. The tension in the air seemed to thicken. Around us, the chants carried on, oblivious to the quiet struggle unfolding here. The ICE officers stood over him, casting long shadows in the late-day sun. James sat in that shadow without flinching. I felt the need to say something, to step in, but my voice caught in my throat. I wasn't sure what I could offer that would change anything. So I stayed where I was, my heart beating fast, and watched. James didn't look away. His eyes, pale and steady, held the weight of a man who had fought his battles long ago. He didn't ask for understanding. He didn't ask for kindness. He only asked to be left alone, to sit in the last warm light of the day and breathe in a city that didn't always remember men like him. And in that quiet moment, as the agents pressed closer, I saw it clearly. This wasn't just an old man on a bench. This was a man who had carried the burden of service, of duty, of memories that no one else could see. And he bore it all with a quiet dignity that no uniform or badge could take away. The protest noise rose again, louder now as more people filled the park. The officers shifted, their hands tightening on their belts. James didn't move. He didn't speak. He just waited, patient and silent, a steady presence in a world that had forgotten how to listen. And I, standing a few feet away, understood in that moment what it meant to be truly seen. Not in the eyes of those who came with questions, but in the way a man holds himself when no one is watching, in the quiet spaces between the noise, in the gentle, unspoken courage that doesn't need words. I watched James Walker, the old soldier who asked for nothing, as the sun slipped lower behind the palm trees, and I realized that even here, in this city of noise and haste, there were still voices worth hearing, voices that spoke in silence, waiting for the world to remember. The tension settled around us like the evening chill. The ICE agents stood tall, clad in black tactical gear that seemed to drink in the light around them. Their eyes were hard, unblinking, as they regarded James like he was just another name on a list. "Sir," the taller agent said, his voice clipped and practiced, "we're going to need to see your permanent resident card or proof of citizenship. This is standard procedure." His partner shifted his stance, the weight of his boots pressing into the dirt path, sending small pebbles skittering away. James let out a slow breath. His eyes, still pale and calm, didn't flicker. He reached back into his jacket pocket, the motion deliberate, fingers brushing the worn leather of his wallet. There was no rush, no sign of fear, just the tired, unhurried movements of a man who had learned that panic never solved much of anything. He pulled the wallet free and opened it with careful fingers. Inside, a battered veteran's ID sat alongside a faded photo of what looked like a much younger man in uniform. He held it out, his hand steady despite the tremor that ran through his knuckles. "This is all I have," James said softly. "It's always been enough before." The taller agent took the ID and turned it over in his hand, his mouth set in a line that spoke of rules and regulations. He barely glanced at the photo. Instead, he looked back at James with a detached sort of focus, like he'd done this 1,000 times and the outcome was always the same. "This is not sufficient," he said flatly. We need something current, something official. Do you have any other documents? His voice was calm, but the edge in it was cold and sharp. It was the voice of a man who didn't see the person in front of him, only the box he needed to tick. James didn't flinch. He took back his wallet, tucking it away with that same slow care. "I'm a citizen," he said quietly. "I fought for this country. That should count for something." The second agent shifted again, his eyes flicking to the crowd that was beginning to gather. The chants from the protest still pulsed in the distance, but here in this small circle of tension, everything felt hushed and close. I saw a young woman in the crowd hesitate, her hand pressed over her mouth. Her eyes met mine for a brief second, and in them, I saw the same question that knotted in my chest. Do we step in? Do we say something? The fear in her face was mirrored in others, a ripple of uncertainty in a sea of noise. But no one moved. No one wanted to be the first to cross that line. The ICE agent's radio crackled, a burst of static that made the air feel even tighter. "We can't let you stay here without proper documentation," he said, shifting his weight forward just enough to loom over James. "We're going to have to ask you to come with us for further questioning." James didn't rise, he didn't argue. He just looked at them, his eyes steady, his shoulders set. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said, each word slow and calm. "I just wanted to rest. That's all." The taller agent frowned. "That's not how this works." His hand moved to the radio clipped at his chest, fingers pressing the button. "We'll need backup here. Possible non-compliance." His tone was cold, like he was reading from a manual. Each word meant to erase the humanity from the man sitting before him. In that moment, something shifted in the crowd. A few more people edged closer, their curiosity and worry fighting with the instinct to stay back. The chants of the protest were a distant hum now, but here, at the edge of the fountain, everything felt like it was holding its breath. And then I saw him, an older man with a shock of white hair and a calm that seemed to settle the air around him. He moved through the small knots of onlookers with a quiet authority, his shoulders squared beneath a faded jacket that bore the same military cut as James's. His name was Franklin Cooper. I didn't know him then, but the way he walked, the way the crowd instinctively made room for him, it told me everything I needed to know. Franklin stopped a few steps from the bench where James sat. His eyes, sharp and steady, met James's for a long moment. And in that gaze, there was recognition, a spark of something shared that cut through the tension like a quiet blade. Without raising his voice, Franklin spoke. "That man is a veteran of this country," he said, his tone low but firm. "He's done more than most of us ever will. He doesn't owe you anything but the truth, and he's given you that already." The ICE agents turned to him, the taller one frowning. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." Franklin didn't waver. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of decades. "It concerns all of us," he said simply. "Because if a man like him can't sit here in peace, then none of us can." The taller agent's jaw tightened. "This is an official investigation. Please step back." Franklin took another step forward, his hands open at his sides. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "James Walker is a citizen. He's earned the right to sit here and breathe this air without answering to anyone." For a moment, there was only the hush of the fountain and the distant rise and fall of protest chants. The ICE agents stood stiff and silent, the hard edges of their gear catching the last of the sun. James looked up at Franklin, a flicker of something relief, maybe passing across his worn face. Around us, the small crowd seemed to lean closer, drawn to the quiet strength in Franklin's voice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it was enough to make people believe again, if only for a moment. The second agent's hand dropped from his radio, his brow furrowing. "Sir," he said, "softer now. We're just following procedure." Franklin's lips pressed together in a thin line. "Procedure is meant to protect people," he said, "not to strip them of their dignity." He glanced at James again, his expression steady. This man has lived long enough to know what that means. The taller agent shifted, glancing back at the small cluster of onlookers. For the first time, there was a crack in his posture, a moment of hesitation that said, maybe, just maybe. He understood. I felt my breath ease a little, my heart steady in my chest, because in that moment, Franklin Cooper stood like a wall between James and the cold, impersonal hands of the system. And it was enough to make the world feel just a little softer. James didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The quiet line of his shoulders, the way his eyes stayed fixed on the man who'd come to stand beside him, it was enough. And in that small clearing, with the sun sinking behind the city skyline and the chants of the protest a distant echo, I understood something simple and powerful, that sometimes the strongest voices aren't the ones that shout. They're the ones that stand firm in the silence, refusing to let the weight of the world crush the light they carry inside. Franklin's presence was a quiet shield, a promise that James would not face this moment alone. And as the evening deepened around us, I saw something in the eyes of those who watched, a glimmer of hope, fragile but real, that maybe the world could still remember how to care. The taller ICE agent narrowed his eyes, his lips pressing into a thin line. Without a word, he lifted his hand and gestured sharply to the K9 handler standing a few feet away. The man with the leash nodded, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. The crowd seemed to draw a collective breath as the handler unclipped the leash. The dog Max, a massive German shepherd with a coat of deep black and tan, shifted his weight forward, muscles tense beneath his thick fur. His ears pricked forward, and his dark eyes locked onto James with a soldier's precision. James didn't move. He sat with his shoulders square, his hands resting loosely on his knees. Around him, the world had narrowed to this single point of tension. The shouts of the protest still echoed faintly in the background. But here, at the center of it all, it was as if time had paused. Max's claws clicked on the pavement as he padded forward, every movement deliberate and powerful. The handler gave a low command, sharp, cold, final. The dog's head lowered, his tail stiff, and he began to close the distance between them. My heart thudded in my chest. I could see the strain in the handler's face, the way his jaw worked as he repeated the command. Search, he barked again, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The crowd shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking from James to the approaching dog. Some of them pulled back a step, instinctively, as if the air had grown too heavy to breathe. James stayed still. His breathing was calm, his gaze steady, and his eyes never left the dog's face. There was no fear in his posture, no flinch or tremor, just the quiet resolve of a man who had faced too many storms to be moved by another. Max was only a few feet away now, his powerful frame moving with a soldier's grace, and then he stopped. It was so sudden that I almost didn't believe what I was seeing. Max froze in place, his ears twitching forward, his nose working the air with quick, shallow breaths. His tail dropped, no longer stiff but relaxed, and his head tilted just slightly to one side. The handler repeated the command, his voice sharper, frustration bleeding through, but Max didn't move. Instead, he took one careful step forward and pressed his nose gently against James's knee. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. I could see it in their faces, the confusion, the wonder, the sudden shift from fear to something softer. James lowered his hand, fingers brushing lightly against the top of Max's head. The dog's tail gave a small, almost hesitant wag, and then, as if something deep inside him had recognized something long lost, Max pushed his head into James's lap and let out a low, contented whine. The handler stared, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find words. The taller ICE agent took a half step back, his brow furrowing as the reality of what he was seeing sank in. James's hand moved slowly, brushing over the dog's ears with a familiarity that spoke of memories shared in places no one else would ever know. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft and a little cracked. "Hello, old boy," he murmured. It's been a long time. The dog responded with a soft whine, pressing closer, his body leaning into the gentle strength of James's hand. In that moment, the hard lines of the ICE agents seemed to falter, their authority overshadowed by something older and deeper than any badge. Franklin Cooper stepped forward then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He rested a hand on James's shoulder, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I told you," he said, "not to the ICE agents, but to everyone who would listen. This man is family to us all. He's earned the right to be here more than any of us." The ICE agents looked at one another, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. The handler took a step back, his hand still outstretched, but Max refused to move. The dog stayed pressed against James, his tail now thumping softly against the dirt. I could feel the air shift around us, like the tension had cracked open to let something gentler through. In the quiet that followed, I noticed another figure approaching a young LAPD officer, his uniform still crisp, his face drawn and unsure. Officer Samuel Brooks. I'd seen him before, standing at the edge of protests, his eyes always searching for something more than just the next order. Now, he paused at the edge of the circle, his hand resting on the radio at his shoulder. For a moment, he hesitated, his gaze flicking between the ICE agents and the quiet tableau of the old soldier and the dog that had chosen him. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this man is a U.S. citizen. He's a veteran, and he's done nothing wrong." The taller ICE agent squared his shoulders, his jaw tight. "Officer, this is a federal matter. We're operating under federal jurisdiction." Brooks nodded once, his eyes never leaving the agents. "I understand," he said evenly, "but this is still my city. And in my city, we don't treat our veterans like this." The words hung there, simple and strong, around us. The small crowd seemed to lean closer, drawn by the quiet certainty in Brooks's voice. The ICE agent opened his mouth as if to argue, but something in the young officer's expression stilled him. Brooks didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, his shoulders straight and his eyes steady. And in that silence, the truth of his words carried farther than any shout. James looked up at him then, his pale eyes meeting the young officer's with a kind of quiet relief. He didn't smile, but there was something softer in the lines of his face, a small easing of the weight he carried. Max let out a low, contented sigh, his head still resting in James's lap. The dog's calm presence seemed to settle over the small clearing like a benediction. And in that moment, I realized we were witnessing something rare. Not a clash of power, but a quiet victory of human decency. A moment when compassion stood taller than authority, and when the bonds of loyalty between soldiers, between friends, even between man and dog proved stronger than fear. The ICE agents hesitated, their posture still tense, but their eyes no longer so certain. They looked at each other, then at the quiet figure on the bench, and for the first time, they seemed to see more than just a file or a regulation. Brooks took a small step forward, his voice lowering to something almost gentle. "Let the man be," he said softly. "He's earned that much." The handler gave a small nod, his hand dropping away from the leash. Max didn't move. He didn't need to. In that moment, he was exactly where he belonged. Franklin squeezed James's shoulder, his own eyes shining with quiet pride. "You're not alone, brother," he said. "Not anymore." And as the last of the sun slipped behind the skyline, the park seemed to breathe a little easier. The crowd, once tight with fear and uncertainty, stood a little taller, and in the quiet between the fading chants and the soft sigh of the breeze, we all understood what it meant to stand together. Officer Brooks took another step forward, his voice steady and sure as he addressed the agents one final time. "Gentlemen," he said, his tone calm but firm, "this man has done nothing wrong. He is a citizen of this country and a veteran who has already given enough." His words settled over the small crowd like a promise, quiet but unshakable. The taller ICE agent hesitated, his gaze flicking back and forth between the young officer and the man seated so calmly on the bench. A long moment passed, the tension thick and heavy in the fading light. Finally, with a tight nod, he lifted his hand and gestured for his team to stand down. The handler clipped Max's leash back onto his collar, though the dog stayed close to James, his dark eyes never leaving the old soldier's face. The other agent shifted his weight, his shoulders relaxing just a fraction as he turned away. Slowly, the ICE officers began to retreat, their black boots crunching softly on the dirt path as they disappeared back through the trees. As they moved away, a hush fell over the clearing. The protest chants still rose in the distance. But here, it was as if the park itself had taken a deep breath. The air felt lighter, and for the first time that evening, I realized I could hear the soft rush of the fountain behind us again. James didn't speak. He didn't need to. He lifted his chin, his pale eyes meeting Officer Brooks with a quiet gratitude. A faint smile curved his lips small, almost shy, but it held a warmth that seemed to ease the tightness in all our chests. Franklin's hand was still on James's shoulder, his own eyes bright with something that looked like pride. He gave a small nod, his voice low and sure. "Told you, brother," he said. "You're not invisible anymore." Officer Brooks offered James a respectful nod, the kind that speaks louder than words. "If you ever need anything, sir," he said softly, "don't hesitate to let us know. You've more than earned that." James only nodded again, his smile deepening just a little. His hands, folded in his lap, trembled faintly, but his back was straight, his head held high. In that simple posture, there was more strength than any uniform or badge could offer. The crowd around us slowly began to disperse, the energy shifting from fear to something closer to reverence. I watched as people who had hesitated before stepped forward now, some offering quiet words of thanks, others simply laying a hand gently on James's shoulder before moving on. One young woman, her phone still raised from recording the moment, caught my eye. She mouthed the words "I'm sorry" before turning away, her cheeks damp with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. It was a small thing, but I saw how it eased the furrow in James's brow. Just a little. Later that night, the first video of what had happened began to spread across the city. In grainy footage lit by the last of the sun, people saw a man who had given his years to service, sitting with quiet dignity as the world finally paused to remember him. They saw Franklin's steady presence, the calm strength of Officer Brooks's stand, and Max's gentle nudge as he claimed James as one of his own. Local news picked up the story within hours. "Veteran mistaken for undocumented immigrant." The headlines read, and people shared the videos with captions like, "Look at this man's quiet strength, and this is what respect looks like." The word spread faster than any command or order could have, carried on a wave of hearts that remembered what it meant to care. Within a week, the city council issued a formal apology, a rare moment of unity that seemed to hush the noise of politics for just a breath. They spoke of James by name, of the service he had given, of the dignity he had carried even when the world tried to strip it away. A few days later, there was a small ceremony at Grant Park, a gathering of neighbors and strangers who had become something more in the quiet spaces of that day. Franklin stood beside James as they unveiled a simple plaque on the bench where he had sat, words etched in brass that read, "To those who served in silence, and to those who remember." James didn't say much at the ceremony. He didn't have to. He stood quietly, his hands in the pockets of that old, worn jacket, and let the warm afternoon sun brush against his face. Max sat faithfully at his side, tail thumping softly every time someone paused to thank the old soldier they'd nearly forgotten. Officer Brooks was there too, his uniform crisp, his expression thoughtful. He shook James's hand once more, his grip firm, and said, "I hope you know this city is better for having you in it, sir." James met his gaze, and for the first time, I saw a small, genuine smile lift the corners of his mouth. As the ceremony ended and people began to drift away, I watched James settle back onto that same bench, He didn't look around for recognition or applause. He didn't need it. He sat with his shoulders straight, his gaze turned to the sky, as if the weight he carried had grown just a little lighter. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on James's worn boot, the two of them a quiet portrait of loyalty and peace. The sun dipped lower behind the city skyline, casting long shadows that stretched across the grass and turned the world to gold. I knew then that this was what it meant to truly be seen, not in the loud voices or the flashing lights, but in the gentle space where one man's quiet dignity could soften even the hardest hearts, in the way a stranger's stand could ripple outward, becoming a testament to something bigger than any of us. James Walker didn't ask for this moment. He didn't demand it, but he accepted it with the same quiet strength he had shown all along, proof that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that speak without saying a word. And as I watched him sitting there, the old dog at his feet and the last of the sun on his face, I felt something settle in my chest, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this world could still remember how to care, that in the steady beat of a heart that refused to bow, there was a lesson for all of us. He didn't need our applause. He didn't need our pity. All he needed was to be seen, truly seen, for the man he was and the life he had lived. And in that moment, I knew we had finally given him that. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.